I'm going to introduce the history of cybersecurity and quantum key distribution, or QKD. Over the years, information transmission has evolved, and we went from messenger pigeons to postmen on buggies to the modern technology innovation that make it less painful to store and communicate information securely. Battelle, a company based in Columbus, Ohio, implemented its first quantum key distribution system in 2013. In simple words, a quantum key distribution is defined as a sophisticated method of secure information that uses polarized photons and extensive elements of physics to store, send, or receive information between two parties usually named Alice and Bob without interference from an outside eavesdropper usually named Eve. So this is a new system that is meant to revolutionize and possibly replace the system that is currently in use, which uses mathematical procedures that are hard but possible to crack. In this presentation, we will review the vulnerabilities and solutions to those vulnerabilities and why QKD should be used widely as a sure and secure way to transmit information.
One of the issues with widespread quantum key distribution is this idea of transmitting the photons across a long distance. What happens is the signal kind of degrades actually over a certain amount of distance, and after a certain point it's completely unreadable through due to noise or interference in that signal. There are a couple solutions that have been proposed recently. One solution is the idea of using dark fibers. These are fiber optic lines that only quantum key signals are being sent across. There's no chance of noise or interference because the only photons in that line are being used for that quantum key signal at that time. Another idea is to send the photons at a certain characteristic wavelength across the line, as what that will do is help to reduce the amount of Rayleigh backscattering. There's this idea in typical fiber optic lines boosting the signal, which is kind of an impossibility in quantum key distribution just due to the fact that you can't boost the signal without actually disrupting it and changing the signal. One solution to all of these issues is to increase the intensity of the laser that transmits those photons. This has problems that will be discussed later in the presentation, but for now it's a pretty solid solution. Now Lauren's going to talk about the fiber optic network and infrastructure.
One of the major problems facing the QKD technology is the lack of a fiber optic infrastructure. Currently, the communication network in the U.S. and across the world is based in copper, with only about 10% of the people in Ohio being covered by a fiber optic network. Unfortunately, QKD requires the fiber optic cables, so a new communication network must be made. The use of fiber optic networks is starting to become more and more common in the cable industry. In the cable industry, they use the fiber optic cables in the middle and second mile of the network, but they leave the last mile of the network as copper. This perfectly suits the cable company's needs, which is simply to provide faster internet and cable services to their customers. However, this sort of setup is not acceptable for the QKD technology. In order to get the QKD technology implemented across the world, we would have to change this last mile to fiber optic networks. This is where we run into a huge cost problem. According to gigaom.com, Google would need $500 million in order to get Google Fiber to 100,000 homes. That's obviously a huge initial investment. In order to overcome these problems, we of course must implement the fiber to home concept. That is, we must get the last mile from the copper cable to the new fiber optic cable. We must also use and improve upon Google's proven business model. When implementing Google Fiber, which is an example of a fiber optic network, Google requires the full cooperation of the local government. That means access to infrastructure, good utility maps, and expedited permits. They require this so that they can have a quick turnaround and start getting a return on their investment. Using this model will ensure the economic viability of the QKD technology. Now Ben will discuss user safeguards.
User safeguards are actually necessary in quantum key distribution, although it's commonly praised as the uncrackable type of code. One of the necessary portions is just the idea that there is a possibility of an eavesdropper actually physically interrupting the line, interrupting that fiber optic line, and accepting a signal and pretending to be the receiver without the sender's knowledge, using a secondary form of communication with the receiver, whether that be something as simple as a phone call or just pinging the other computer. It will, let the sender and receiver know whether or not that person has gotten the signal, and if they haven't, then they can assume that it's either been compromised or that it just didn't get through, and they'll refuse to send that information across the line. Another way that an eavesdropper could get the key from the sender is to kind of siphon off some of the photons from the signal. There's no real perfect way to send single photons at a time through a light source like a laser. So you may end up creating duplicates of the same key. It won't be every photon, but for the most part, many of those photons will be duplicated, and enough can be duplicated that an eavesdropper could hack into the signal and get the key. One way to protect against this is to use what are known as quantum decoys. The idea being that use a laser, a very weak laser, very low intensity, that mostly sends single photons, but purposely sends many photons at once to kind of trick the eavesdropper into thinking that it has the opportunity to take so many photons out of the signal. And once those photons are redirected, the hope is that if there's an eavesdropper, they'll end up taking too many of the non-duplicate photons and setting off a signal or an alarm after they cross that error rate. The real solution to all of these problems with the actual use of quantum cryptography is to use a type of interval detector, device that will pull the incoming photons, and every so often will take a sample of the photons based on when the signal was sent. And based on previous polls, it will eliminate noise and interference from the new signal. It will kind of take the difference between the signal it wants and the signal it had, and that difference will be what is expected to be the key. The benefit is it takes out that noise, and also if the key doesn't arrive within that specified interval, it knows that it went somewhere that it wasn't supposed to go, assumedly, an eavesdropper, and it'll alert both the sender and receiver to not transmit any more information across that line. All right, now Gilles going to go ahead and lead us out with a conclusion.
In conclusion, we feel that quantum key distributions popularity will grow stronger in the coming years. But for that to happen in the United States in particular, three things need to be dealt with. The first is U.S. firms and U.S. government need to be aware of QKD's importance because we are playing catch-up with Europe. Secondly, the usage of fiber optic cables is critical to QKD's functionality. And finally, experts or scientists in quantum physics and computer engineering need to answer an important question. Is quantum key distribution 100% secure? Overall, quantum key distributions issues are minor and can be dealt with if the proper support is given by scientists, generous donors, and the government.